Hey guys, this is a new series that I've been working on for a while that is basically going to cover every single thing you need to know to be a good AD carry, from the basic stuff all the way to the more advanced stuff. Now before we kick this off, remember the giveaway for August is still going on to win 2 lots of $10 RP, and all you have to do is click the link below, be subscribed, and you're entered. Anyway, link for that is down below, make sure you do that, and let's get started. So first things first, this video is going to cover every single AD carry except 2, and I don't really consider Quinn and Urgot AD carries. Quinn is more of a top lane bully split pusher like Tryndamere, and Urgot is more of an anti-carry with a completely different playstyle, so I'm not really going to go over those two in this video. So what about if you're new to AD carries, so if you're kind of coming over from a different role? Well, there are 3 champions that I recommend you play, and they are Graves, Ezreal, and Caitlyn. So these 3 are relatively easy to grasp. They have good ability damage, they have escape so you can make mistakes, and they're most similar to other roles in how their damage works as well. So these are who I recommend you learn AD with, and when you're learning AD you want to focus on farming first, and then when you can farm well, then you start to attack the enemy AD when you don't have a minion to kill. That is a very simple laning phase. Then after that you group with your team, you stay at the back, and you attack the closest target, and bam, you basically double lift already. So how do ADs actually work? Like, where does their damage come? And really it's split into 2 things, so auto attacks and abilities. Now in lane it's kind of simple, like auto attacks and abilities both hurt because it's just early into the game. Mid game is where it's a little bit different. You're going to have some levels, you have some rank in your abilities, and that is when ability damage really comes into it. So if you think of like Graves burst for example, when people don't have much defense or health, burst has more effect. Like in a mid game fight, his Q and his ultimate are capable of taking half of someone's health, but late game it might only do something like 25% of their health. So this is when we get to late game, when people have more health, they have more defenses, and that is when you're going to be doing damage with your auto attacks with items and crit. They're going to hurt so much more. So even in some cases, like Caitlyn for example and her Q, you actually want to stop using that ability so that you can auto attack more and hopefully get more crits. So we said that AD carries damage is basically split like into ability damage and also auto attack damage, right? And just some champions with their kit are better at the ability damage side and some are better at the auto attack side. So this is kind of roughly where most ADs fit into the game. So on the ability damage we have people like Sivir, Ezreal, Corki, Varus, Graves, Lucian, Miss Fortune, and on the other side, so the auto attacks, we have Jinx, Vayne, Draven, Calista, Tristana, Kogmaw, Ashe, and Twitch. So you'd think that because the ability damage is mainly mid game and auto attacks are kind of late game, that this is how you would split them, right? You'd have the ability damage as early mid game champions and you have the auto attacks as the late game champions, but there are actually a few who don't fit into that. So first up is Ezreal, and he's kind of both. Like, he is very reliant on items for his abilities to do damage, so similar in a way to auto attacks needing items and coming into the game later. Vayne is another weird one who doesn't really fit into this. Because of her W and her tumble, she has tools to make her auto attack style do more damage earlier, so she can still do a lot mid game even though she is auto attack based. This is actually very similar to Draven as well. He's completely different. Like, yes, he is auto attack based, but most of his damage comes from his Q, and his axes have a high AD bonus just like an ability, which means his mid game is really strong. Another weird one is Calista. And Calista doesn't really fit because ideally she really wants to be late game, I guess, to be the sustained damage source. Like, mid game tends to be burst, right? And Calista just doesn't have burst. The weird thing is that actually Calista can be strong late, but she can be strong mid game as well with how she dukes around and gets a decent amount of damage off, so she doesn't really fit anywhere. So the last 2 that don't really fit as much are Kogmaw and Ashe, and they're both definitely late game champions, don't get me wrong, but with Kogmaw he has a good boost of damage after Triforce, which can help his mid game. Ashe is very similar, that she's auto attack based, but her Q, her volley, which gives her a boost of damage mid game, still means that she has the tools to do damage with fewer items. So what about lane strength then? Like, who is really good in lane, who is good early? And honestly, any AD can win a lane, but these have a natural advantage in some way that makes winning a lane a lot easier. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to go through each champion and I'm going to highlight the things that make them really good in lane. So for Draven, for example, his axes make trading autos basically impossible for the opponent. With Caitlyn, she has higher range, she's just going to poke with autos and push you back and get farmed that way. Calista, her W passive damage is absolutely crazy. She hops around, which makes trading with her very hard, and she has very good damage. Moving on to Tristana, and this is a weird one because she used to be kind of poop in lane, but her E damage is actually really strong now, especially when she jumps, and she's a very good pusher, which is just a natural advantage. Moving on to Ashe, she's similar to Kate. She has a high range, good volley poke, and the constant crits when you're auto-attacking the enemy as well. Sivir is a little bit different to the others because she isn't really a bully. She just pushes over and over and blocks your damage, so there's no real way to shut her down. Corki is actually kind of weak in the early levels, but with a few levels, he really starts to hurt because he's got some ranks in his Q and the passive on his auto. Probably the biggest lane bully is actually Graves, and his passive means he takes less damage, he pushes really hard, he has a ton of burst, and he's impossible to trade with. Lucian is like a weaker version of Graves, basically. He has burst, he has good short trades, he can poke from range with his Q, and it makes laning against him very difficult. Finally, Misfortune. Misfortune's kind of flying under the radar a lot of the time, but her base damage is just really high, and she's very good poke with her Q. Okay, so far we've gone over who is a mainly ability based, who is auto attack, who mid game, who's late game, and also who is a lane bully, and these are the things you're going to be using to decide what AD you want to play. So first off, you have to decide what kind of player you are, like what you enjoy, and then if you enjoy being this kind of mid-game bursty champion, then go and see what I've said is mid-game and pick one of those. Or maybe you enjoy something more late-game like a Jinx and auto-attack champion, so you can go and have a look and pick one of them. Now we're going to go into more detail though. We're going to go through every single AD carry and we're going to highlight what makes them really good, why you would actually pick them, their like special strengths I guess, and also their main weakness as well. So first up is going to be Vayne, and we're going to be looking at her 4 biggest strengths, so her 4 key things and then 1 key weakness as well. So really how I want you to use this is when you're picking AD, you look at Vayne and you say, okay, she's really good at these 4 things. If I can do these 4 things in this game, if they're going to be useful, then Vayne is a good pick. Or maybe if the biggest weakness is going to be really bad this game, then you might not want to pick her. So her 4 biggest strengths then. She has a crazy mid to late game. She does % health damage with her W, which makes her really good at killing high health targets like tanks. She has high mobility and stealth with her ultimate, which keeps her relatively safe in team fights. Her biggest weakness is that she actually has no ability damage, and the reason this is so bad is because if you're not in range for your auto attacks, like if you're forced away for a little bit, you have nothing else to supplement your damage at all. If you think about it, someone like a Graves for example, if he's forced out of the fight, then he can just turn around and you can use his ultimate, he can use his Q, and he doesn't actually have to be auto attacking to do damage, but with Vayne you do. So moving on to Jinx then, her passive is OP as hell for team fights. Like if you get that first kind of reset, then you can kite people really easily, you can run away or you can chase people, and it's just great. She has an attack speed steroid on her Q. If you change that form, then she has an AoE high range rockets, which is what you're going to be using most of the time. And finally, she has a long range snipe ultimate. The biggest problem with Jinx is that she's very easily dived on. Like yes, she does have her chompers to defend herself, but that's all she really has, and she's going to struggle if people jump onto her and lock her down. Tristana is probably one of the best, if not the best late game monster right now, especially with that attack speed steroid on her Q and her really high range as well at level 18. She's really good at taking towers with her E, which means you can get a tower very quickly if left alone, and you're very safe, like you have a jump away and you have your knockback with your ultimate. The biggest problem with Tristana is her mid game is not very good. Like she has a little bit of dip similar to Caitlyn, and you do need items to do damage because she doesn't really have any abilities to rely on. Moving on to Lucian, and Lucian is a lane bully. He's very good at short burst trades, like you will dash in with your E, double shot with your passive, Q, double shot, and that's a huge amount of damage that is very difficult to return. He's really mobile with his E, very high mobility, especially once you've maxed it. He has good poke with his Q and his ultimate, which makes laning against him pretty hard. The biggest problem actually, funny enough, is that his Q is very easily dodged. Like people can flash it, they can even just sidestep it without meaning to, and that's a big portion of your damage suddenly gone. Okay, so moving on to Caitlyn. She has crazy late game with her headshot. Like ever since her headshot has been reworked to do even more damage, it is ridiculous late game. She is a very strong lane bully with her high range, so she's also relatively safe, and she is very good at pushing towers just because of that high range. The biggest problem with Caitlyn is very similar to Tristana. Like she has a very subpar mid game. When she's strong early, she has a lot of bully potential, but then she kind of dips because she needs items to do damage, and that is where her late game comes in. So moving on to Graves then. and Graves has a huge amount of burst, probably the highest burst out of any other AD carry, and his passive makes him very tanky as well. The combination of these two makes his lane phase incredible. He has a low cooldown dash and an attack speed steroid attached to it, and a great early to mid game. The biggest problem with Graves is that he's very cooldown reliant for damage. Like, he needs his Q and his ultimate to really kill people, and unfortunately as the game goes later and later, those abilities don't really do as much damage anymore. Moving on to Sivir, and Sivir has insane wave clear. Her ultimate is OP for team fights and in lane actually as well. Like, you can ult people into gank, you can ult your team into a team fight. It's just great. She has really good poke with her W and her Q as well, and a really solid team fight. The biggest problem with Sivir is that she does have semi-low range, and in team fights she doesn't really have an escape or anything like that, so she can struggle with people diving onto her. Holy crap, I forgot how many ADs there are. Okay, moving on to Ezreal. He is probably the safest AD carry. He has a really high range poke in his kite and his kit, and a really high burst with his ultimate as well, which is something people underrate. Like, his ultimate does less damage when it goes through minions, and that's a very important thing to remember. If you hit someone without it hitting a minion first, it does crazy damage. The other underrated thing about Ezreal, funny enough, is the attack speed steroid with his passive, which you get full stacks of if you use your ultimate. Like, that in a team fight is really strong. The biggest problem with Ezreal is he's pretty weak without items, and he has a pretty weak lane phase as well. So if you don't get ahead and you don't really get your items, then you are going to be pretty weak mid game. Oh, Calista. This is like every AD carry's nightmare playing against a Calista. She has probably the best kite in the game, honestly. Her W passive damage is overpowered as hell as well. She's really good sustain damage with her E, which is kind of like Twitch, just a little bit better, and she can engage and peel with her ultimate as well. The biggest problem with Calista is something we hinted at earlier, is that she lacks burst and lacks quick damage. So if a team fight is going to be over quickly, then she doesn't really have a chance to do any damage. So moving on to Ashe, and Ashe is definitely the best playmaking AD that you can play. So if you want to make plays and you want to kind of snowball the game and engage, then Ashe is definitely the one for you. Her arrow is ridiculous for that engage and for her playmaking. She has a perma slow, which makes her really good at kiting as well. Surprisingly, her damage is actually good throughout the game. Like, normally when you are a auto attack reliant champion, your damage comes late game when you have the items, but Ashe is actually okay mid game as well, and part of that is because she has a really high range. The biggest problem with Ashe is that she has no escape, and an arrow point blank doesn't really last very long, so isn't really good for peel either. Okay, so moving on to Draven, and I get flamed for this all the time for saying it, but fuck it, I'm gonna say it anyway. Draven is one of the hardest AD carries to play, and part of that is because his axes, like catching them in a team fight, is really difficult. So the passive on Draven can mean he snowballs really hard if he gets a kill. Like, the gold from it can add up pretty fast. He has really good burst and really good sustain damage, which is pretty rare. Late game, you're going to be critting for over 1,000, which is ridiculous. He's a really strong lane bully and a really strong mid to late game as well. The biggest problem with Draven, similar to everyone else without an escape, is that he just doesn't have an escape and can be jumped on and locked down. Like, if you're playing against someone like a Vayne, she'll just ult you and it's really hard to do anything. Okay, so moving on to Corki, and he has an amazing mix of magic and AD damage, and a lot of that is burst as well. He has a really high mid-game boost in power after finishing his Triforce, and a lot of that is to do with how much damage his poke does as well. The biggest problem with Corki is he is not the strongest AD late game. He doesn't really have like a solid late game build or anything. He doesn't really revolve around crit, so that's why he's really strong mid-game and then falls off a little bit. Okay, last four guys. These are kind of the underrated ADs who aren't really played very much. The first one is going to be Misfortune. Her lane phase is really good, and she is actually probably one of the best lane phases out of any other AD carry. She has a very high impact ultimate. She has a crazy mid game, partly because of that ultimate, and okay mobility with her W rework as well. Again, very similar to Corki, her late game damage is not amazing. Like, it is better than Corki. You can build crit and you can work pretty well, but her abilities that she relies on aren't going to be doing too much. Moving on to Twitch, and he has a very high impact ultimate as well and can snowball with his stealth, great at catching people when they're alone, which is really good for snowballing mid game. Something that's pretty underrated about Twitch is that he actually has a lot of burst damage. Like, when he comes out of stealth, he has the attack speed steroid, activate your ultimate, and you're going to be killing someone pretty quick. The biggest problem with Twitch is that he has a very weak lane phase. Like, he can't really trade very well, you can't stealth in and kill people, so you're going to struggle to get ahead. So next up is Varus, and Varus has kind of been played as a mid champion right now, but he's actually still an AD carry, so we're going to mention him anyway. He has amazing poke, which you can obviously see because that's why he's been played in the mid lane. He has really high range, which makes his lane phase good, and his ultimate is great in teamfights for locking people down. The biggest problem with Varus is that he has no escapes. That means he's ganked very easily or locked down by a support in the bot lane, which is kind of why he's being played mid lane at the moment, because he can sit back and just farm. Final AD carry, holy crap, that was a long list, is going to be Kogmaw, and this is another one who's actually been played in the mid lane a lot. Now Kogmaw melts tanks late game like ridiculously easy and has a very high range with his W active as well. Something that's very underrated about him is that he has a very good mix of magic and AD damage, and funnily enough actually, you're probably going to be doing about 50-50, like 50% AD damage and 50% AP by the end of the game. Another underrated thing about Kogmaw is the armor shred on his Q. Like you can actually shred 30% at max rank of someone's MR and armor as they're running towards you if you hit them. Kogmaw probably has the biggest weakness out of every single AD carry in that he has no mobility and he's very vulnerable to getting dived on, which is why people like in competitive will play protect the Kogmaw comps, because they need the protection to keep him alive. So there you go, that basically covers what AD you will pick, and that is the first thing to being a good AD carry, is understanding the picks. If you enjoyed this, please let me know with a like or a comment, it really helps me out. Share it with your friends if you enjoyed it as well. I put a lot of effort into this video, so I hope you guys enjoy it, and there'll be a lot more different and more advanced episodes with this, but that's all for this time, so I will catch you in my next video.